All right, everyone. So, welcome back. This is Kebab, but this is going to be a little bit of a different type of video because today we're going to be talking about the digestive system. So, there's a lot of people that are prepping for the Mcat, trying to figure out how exactly the digestive system works. There's a bunch of information on it, but honestly, I just wanted to sort of like get it all down, get it into a super digestible amount of information that's like pretty easy for people to process. So that's going to be hopefully the point of this video. But a little bit of notation before we start. I like labeling my carbohydrates as pink, my fats as yellow, and the proteins as green. And you'll see that as we go through this presentation, it'll make it a little bit easier for you to follow. But first of all, we're going to go ahead and do an overview. So we're going to start talking about the actual pathway that the food takes, because the whole point of digestion and the digestive system is to take food, eat it, obviously, right? That's the purpose of your mouth and all of that. But then after that, we want to take the nutrients out of the food and actually break them down into their individual monomeric units. And then we're going to use those for energy and all of that fun stuff down the line. But first of all, we actually have to absorb the nutrients from the food. So we're going to start at the mouth, and then we're going to work our way down the mouth through the esophagus. All right. And then after we pass through the esophagus, we're going to hit the stomach. The stomach's going to be really cool. We're going to see a lot of really awesome stuff that takes place there. But then after the stomach, we hit this pathway over here into the small intestine. Now, the small intestine itself is a pretty amazing organ, but around it, you can see that I actually didn't number the pancreas, liver, or gallbladder. And that's because those are called accessory organs, meaning that they're not actually organs that food travels through, but rather they help us digest food. And so they're going to be really important. We're going to go into a little bit of depth on that. But yeah, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas are accessory organs to digestion. And then after our small intestine, we're going to go through this whole entire little snaky thing before we come out the other side, and we're going to enter our large intestine. And the large intestine, we're going to go up all the way around through the rectum and then out the anus on the other side. So that's going to be a little bit of an overview of the digestive system, and that's how all of these organs sort of fit together. But again, remember, carbohydrates we're going to be treating as pink, fats as yellow, and proteins as green. So our first destination is going to be the mouth, and really it's going to be the mouth and the throat. And an important thing to see here is that we have our oral cavity. So you're going to remember this if you study respiratory at all. But the oral cavity is obviously, where air comes in. It can be called the oropharynx. Up here you might have your nasopharynx, which isn't really important for digestion. You don't want to be snorting food up your nose. But we have our oropharynx, or oral cavity, all right? And we're going to see that there are three glands that are located within our oral cavity. You have your parotid gland, you're going to have your sublingual gland, and you're going to have your submandibular gland. And all of these are going to be super important in secreting two different enzymes here. You can see the first one is salivary amylase. And keep in mind, it has that pink color, meaning that it's used to break down carbohydrates. And we also have salivary lipase, which is yellow, and that's going to be our second enzyme. Because it's yellow, we can see that it helps us digest fat. So already, once you've started eating that hamburger, you're going to be digesting the carbohydrates and the fats just by the food touching your saliva. All right. And what's going to happen is, as we begin to chew on this food, this amazing hamburger that is going to first come in, I know looking at a blue hamburger might not be the most appetizing thing in the world, but we're going to take that hamburger, we're going to chew it up, and I think everyone recognizes these as teeth. I'm sorry if mine are a little scarier, but our teeth are going to break down the food and form what we call a bolus. Now, a bolus is literally just sort of like, imagine it like a blob, and that blob is sort of like encased in like all of this mucus and saliva and stuff that's like digesting it. But it's going to be a lot easier for that bolus to travel through our esophagus and the rest of our digestive system than it would be for an entire freaking hamburger to try to work its way down. So that's why your mouth is super important. First of all, it begins the process of digestion through saliva, but then also we're able to form this bolus that's actually going to be traveling down the rest of our digestive tract. Now over here we have an important structure. It is called the epiglottis, and the importance of the epiglottis lies in the fact that it blocks the trachea. Now again, from the respiratory system, if you're going to remember, the trachea helps us breathe. It's our windpipe, and we obviously don't want food going down into there because that would cause choking. And so when the bolus travels over the epiglottis, gravity helps us out and basically allows the bolus to travel straight over that and down into the esophagus, which is absolutely amazing because it's a very simple system, but it prevents us from getting food down our trachea, which obviously isn't great. And so over here, overall anatomy to know. You should know the glands. You should also know salivary amylase and salivary lipase. We do not digest proteins in the upper part of the digestive system. You should know the pharynx. The pharynx is the same thing as the respiratory system as well. It's this area in the back. And then you should know the esophagus, which is going to be our next destination. Now, if you have water or a snack or something like that close by you, and you go ahead and swallow it really quickly, you'll notice that your Adam's apple area will actually move, and that's because the top third of your esophagus is actually controlled by skeletal muscle, which is really amazing. And that means that we're able to actually regulate control of it. But that's only the top third. The bottom 2/3 of the esophagus, as we're pushing the bolus through, is controlled by smooth muscle. That's under autonomic control, which is incredibly important to note, because you don't feel yourself kind of like moving your muscles over there. And what actually gets it down isn't this intentional constriction of the skeletal muscle up here. Instead, it's a force that we call peristalsis. And peristalsis is basically just a rhythmic contraction of the smooth muscle lining that allows the bolus to slowly travel through. Now up here you'll see that we have something called the upper esophageal sphincter, and down here the lower esophageal sphincter. Sphincters, you can just think of them as one-way valves. So basically they allow the bolus to travel in one direction, and that's super important for guiding the direction of peristalsis and the overall movement of the food. Those rhythmic contractions push the food through, they go through the sphincters, and those act as one-way valves. And again, that's super, super important, because our next destination is going to be the stomach. And once we get to the stomach, this is super, super acidic. You don't want any of this stuff coming back up. And if it did, then you'd experience what we commonly call heartburn. And that's because, a little bit of that acidic fluid managed to get past your lower esophageal sphincter and is now burning your esophagus. So that's typically when we call heartburn. It has nothing to do with your heart. It's just that gastric reflux of stomach acid coming up your esophagus. And so hopefully y'all are able to understand everything now that you should know for the esophagus, and feel free to rewind if you need to look at that a little bit more closely. But next we have our stomach, and the stomach, I think that there's a couple ways to approach it, but there's some really fundamental things to understand about the stomach. And the first part is the anatomy. So at the top, obviously we have our esophagus that we just talked about, and our lower esophageal sphincter, which opens up into the stomach, and there's these different segments that I've highlighted. So at the beginning of the stomach, we have our little cardia section. I guess that's because it's close to the heart. But then we have our fundus. Now the fundus, I remember as it kind of looks like a mushroom, and mushrooms are types of fungi, and that's a little mnemonic that I use for remembering the fundus. The body, I'm a pretty big guy, and so I think of the body being this big part of the stomach. You have your antrum down here, and then after that you have the pylorus. And look at that, it was like the people that were coming up with the anatomy were sort of thinking about this, because it turns out that the next sphincter that controls the movement of stuff past the stomach is called the pyloric sphincter, and that's because it's right next to the pylorus. So that's a helpful way of remember that. And so we can see that we go from the esophagus through the stomach and then out into the small intestine. But let's look at the stomach a little bit more, because obviously we know that there's important contents that take place that are within the stomach that are worth knowing. And that's these little exocrine gland ducts. Now there's several different types of cells in there that you should be aware of. And we're going to quickly do an overview of those types of cells. And then in the next part, I'm going to talk about how it all fits together. So first of all, we have these mucus cells, which are exactly what they sound like. They secrete mucus into the stomach. Now, why is mucus important? Well, you got to remember that the stomach has a pH of around 2, and that's extremely acidic. Remember, pH is on a logarithmic scale, and we're secreting hydrochloric acid into this area, and obviously we don't want to digest ourselves. The whole point of this is to digest the food, but we don't want to digest ourselves. And so this mucus is going to be bicarbonate rich, right? Bicarbonate, if you'll remember, is HCO3-. And so basically that'll help to neutralize the acid that is making immediate contact with the walls of the stomach, and that basically keeps you from digesting yourself, which, everyone appreciates. Now, we also have chief cells, and chief cells are pretty cool, because keep in mind they have this yellow and this green arrow coming off, yellow and green. And remember, yellow means fat and green means protein. So we have gastric lipase coming out of these chief cells, and we have pepsinogen coming out of these cells. Pepsinogen is the first green thing we've seen, which means that it is the first time we're going to be digesting protein. And pepsinogen keep in mind, is a zymogen, and we can tell that because it has the OGEN ending, which means this is an inactive protein when it's secreted by these chief cells and needs to be converted into its active form, which is pepsin. So pepsin is, and I can go ahead and make this green for you guys, pepsin is the first enzyme that's actually going to begin digesting proteins, which is super, super important to note. Next, we have our G cells, all right? G cells are pretty cool. So G cells are going to be releasing gastrin, hence the name. Also, little mnemonic for chief cells is, when I think of the chief cells, I think of the Chiefs, and Chiefs make me think of football, and football makes me think of the Packers. And so I know that the Packers are yellow and green, and that's a little mnemonic I use for the chief cells. But again, G cells secrete gastrin. That's where they get their name from. And then finally, we have, the big dogs themselves, the parietal cells, secrete, the all-important HCl, but they also secrete intrinsic factor, and we'll get into what that is now. So I have included a little image from, the last picture of all of the, kind of what one of these exocrine ducts looks like within the stomach. But now let's look at how all of this fits together. So imagine I go and I'm going to Mcat's and I see a burger, right? This burger, it looks amazing. It's like a Big Mac. And whether or not you actually enjoy the Big Mac, you have to admit, when you see a Big Mac, when you see a really nice, well put together burger, you're like, that's yummy. When you smell the Big Mac, that's going to be like, oh, I really want to digest that. When I taste the Big Mac, I'm like, oh man, that's incredible. My stomach should start digesting it. And when I start chewing on the Big Mac, all of these are signals that are coming from my brain telling me it is time to digest this Big Mac. And so what that's called is that's the initiation of the cephalic phase. And when you think cephalic, think of electroencephalograms or EEGs, right? That has to do with the brain. And so these are signals that are coming from your brain telling you it is time to start digesting food. And so those signals travel down what's called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve sort of runs down your neck on the front side of it. And it's super cool. It's super important nerve. But the ultimate point of the vagus nerve is that it leads to the release of acetylcholine. Now you're like, wait a second. I thought acetylcholine was involved with muscles. I thought that was the neurotransmitter that stimulated muscular contractions. The neurons that actually travel down the vagus nerve and down over to the stomach actually release this acetylcholine, and that acetylcholine ultimately ends up triggering the release of gastrin-releasing protein. Now, gastrin-releasing protein, it's in the name. It's going to want to release gastrin, and what releases gastrin? Well, it's these G cells, And so this acetylcholine will indirectly, through GRP, actually upregulate the activity of G cells. And so G cells are now secreting gastrin, and gastrin, as you can see by this plus sign, activates parietal cells. Remember, parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and they secrete intrinsic factor. But what's another way we can secrete parietal cells? Well, that's through ECL cells, all right? And I want you guys to go ahead, look at these cells, give them a hug, maybe a pat on the head, a kiss on the cheek, and then forget about them because you're honestly never going to remember them. The only thing you should remember about ECL cells is that they secrete histamines. And what other cells secrete histamines? Mast cells. And mast cells do that in terms of an immune function, but ECL cells secrete it in terms of a digestive function, and histamines actually upregulate parietal cells. And so now with these parietal cells upregulated, they start secreting intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor, all you should know is it helps in vitamin B12 digestion, okay? But more importantly, it secretes hydrochloric acid, all right? This is a big dog. Remember, we have a pH of 2 and we need to get there somehow. And that's through these parietal cells secreting hydrochloric acid. There's actually 4 functions of hydrochloric acid that you should be aware of for the exam. And a lot of them actually have to do with pepsin, which is that protein that we had that was actually involved in the digestion of it's a protein involved in the digestion of protein. It's an enzyme. And so the first function of hydrochloric acid is it's going to go ahead and raise the acidity of the stomach, lowering the pH to stimulate the chief cells, which we talked about right over here, right? The chief cells right over here, to go ahead and release gastric lipase, right? Yellow for actually breaking down fats, and pepsinogen. So the first step of HCl is actually to get that pepsinogen secreted. The second step is to go ahead and activate that pepsinogen. Again, it's in an acidic environment. It's going to break down that zymogen, and it's going to cause that inactive form to get converted into the active form. And so now we're activating our pepsinogen. And then after that, we're going to go ahead and begin denaturing proteins. Again, remember, proteins in the biological systems vibe at physiological pH. That's around 7.4, right? And once they start getting into this acidic environment, when things are, not looking great anymore for them, they start to unfold. They begin to denature. And that creates a bunch of active sites, potential targeting points for pepsin to attack. And so now, not only have we caused the pepsinogen to get released, that inactive zymogen, and not only have we then activated that inactive zymogen, but now we've created sites where it can attack. And so all three of these functions are focused on pepsinogen alone. And the fourth function is obviously, we don't like acids unless, they're helping us out, and neither do bacteria. So hydrochloric acid obviously also ends up killing the unwanted bacterial cells. Keep in mind, some of these suckers manage to survive. That's not great, but, a lot of them actually end up dying to this hydrochloric acid. And so this is, kind of like an overview of what you should be familiar with when it comes to, the actual process of the cephalic phase and then the gastric phase. So cephalic phase precedes the gastric phase. The cephalic phase is, mentally we become prepared to actually digest the food, and that's where all of this stuff through the vagus nerve comes. And the gastric phase is like the secretion of all of the digestive enzymes and stuff in the stomach. So now let's just put things into perspective just before we move on. We now have our bolus that managed to come down our esophagus, right? It's entered the body of the stomach, which has a super low pH. And from there, we digest it, we break down that bolus, we secrete a bunch of enzymes, and now we have this thing coming out the other side called chyme. And I think of chyme as this green stuff that's like super acidic and is like, basically in the process of broken down, but it's a fluid now. It's no longer a solid. It's traveled through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine, which is our next destination. But before we go into the small intestine, it is important that we talk about our friends in the digestive pathway, because although food doesn't travel to them, through them, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas play incredibly important roles in the actual digestion of food. So we're coming out of the stomach now. We have our chyme coming through the pyloric sphincter, and we hit this area of the small intestine called the duodenum. And the duodenum, you have to remember this. This is a super, super important structure, and it forms this like C-like shape. But the important thing about the duodenum is that it connects to these all of these accessory organs, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, and each one of these serves an important function that you should know for the Mcat. The liver secretes bile, and bile is important. Keep in mind it's yellow, which means that it has to do with fats. Bile is important for emulsifying fats, because keep in mind that fats are really just hydrophobic. At the end of the day, if we look at fatty acids, they have a structure that kind of looks like that. Pardon my, chain over here, but this is all hydrophobic. Those are all hydrocarbons, right? And so this is super nonpolar. And we need to have an amphipathic molecule, right? A molecule that has both polar and nonpolar regions to emulsify these fats and allow them to actually get, taken up by the body, right? The liver also helps us to store vitamins A, D, and B12. It's involved in deamination reactions, which help us to form urea, which is then, excreted out of the system. This is also involved in protein breakdown a little bit. We have glycogen that's stored and broken down there. We have gluconeogenesis that takes place here, detoxification, and the complement system, which is a part of your immune system. So a bunch of stuff is taking place in your liver, and you should really love your liver. But the important thing that you should know for this is that it secretes bile. That bile is then stored in the gallbladder. So the gallbladder is, a tiny little organ, very, very small, that lives right underneath your liver, and it stores the bile. And when certain hormones act on the gallbladder, which we'll talk about, that causes the secretion of this bile into the duodenum via this shunt right here. All right, so keep in mind, the liver, number one, is going to produce it, and then the gallbladder is going to contract and secrete it out into the duodenum, the bile. All right, next we have the pancreas, and the pancreas may very well actually be my favorite organ in this entire process, all right? Before we get into the pancreas, let's break down the small intestine a little bit. We have the duodenum, which is the first part that we talked about. Then we have this area called the jejunum, and then we have the ileum. Now, the duodenum is involved in digestion. It's kind of like the last point where we're really digesting foods. And then we have the jejunum and the ileum, which begin the process of absorption, okay? Now, The reason why I bring this up is because our pancreas is going to end up secreting digestive enzymes into the duodenum that are going to be extremely important into breaking down food. The thing is, it's not a one-way street, you know? The enzymes that come from the pancreas are actually stimulated by hormones that are secreted from the duodenum. And so two of those hormones that are super, super important to know for the Mcat are CCK and secretin. So CCK goes ahead and it upregulates activity of what is called the exocrine pancreas. I break down the pancreas into two main functions. There is the endocrine pancreas and the exocrine pancreas. We'll go ahead and talk about those in a little bit, but understand that the CCK hormone upregulates activity of the exocrine pancreas, and it also stimulates bile release from the gallbladder. It causes this gallbladder to contract, releasing this bile from the gallbladder into the duodenum. All right, and that's super important. So that's CCK. And then we have secretin, which, secretin secretes stuff, and it causes the pancreas to secrete pancreatic juices. Now, this isn't like a milkshake. Pancreatic juices are, bicarbonate, right? This HCO3 minus, right, which remember we saw in the mucus earlier, and H2O. And the reason is this duodenum is coming right off of the stomach, which is an acidic environment. We need to neutralize some of that acid. So it's really important that we secrete these pancreatic juices to help neutralize that acid. But now we need to go ahead and let's break down the pancreas just a little bit more. So the pancreas itself, like I said, can be broken down into the endocrine pancreas and the exocrine pancreas. And you can think about these as kind of like the CIA and the FBI. Now, the reason why I think of the endocrine pancreas as the CIA, and you can see this little thing, this little animation here, is that the endocrine pancreas is basically kind of like telling, releasing hormones, which are like almost like the Secret Service, like nudging other, like countries and stuff like that. Like, hey, buddy, like, I really think you should do this, or hey, you know what, so-and-so has to do that somewhere else, right? Like, it's kind of calling the shots in this area. And so the endocrine pancreas is really ending up like, calling all of the shots in this situation. It has three different types of cells that you should be familiar with. And you have the alpha cells, which release glucagon, which ultimately end up increasing your blood glucose level. Because the purposes of this presentation are not about, glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. I won't go into depth on that, but glucagon increases your blood glucose level. The beta islet cells end up releasing insulin, which decreases your blood glucose level usually. And then you have the delta cells, which release somatostatin. Now, somatostatin is extremely important because it is the negative feedback regulator to digestive enzyme secretion, as I've written down here. And I've written that in red because it's really important that you don't just keep releasing digestive enzymes. Obviously, you don't want to digest yourself. And so it's super critical that we have some way to rein back in this system and not digest ourselves, which at the end of the day is ideal. So that is the endocrine pancreas. Now, on the other side, though, we have the exocrine pancreas, and this is a freaking SWAT team. This is kind of like the FBI busting down doors, which is incredibly telling because the exocrine pancreas releases enzymes that directly act on the actual chyme itself. It helps to break down the food and actually absorb it. So that's why you can see this image of, these SWAT team people breaking down a door. That is because they're very much involved. They're not like the CIA calling shots for things to happen off in the distance. No, they're very much at it. And that's the exocrine pancreas. And you can see that there's this thing called the pancreatic duct, which is incredibly important in actually releasing, these individual, the enzymes from the pancreas out into the duodenum itself. So let's talk a little bit more about the exocrine pancreas. Again, this is the thing that we said was kind of like the FBI or the SWAT team breaking down a door. And there are specific types of cells that you should know. So we have CCK coming in from the duodenum that's going to cause all of this to act, and then that's going to trigger a bunch of stuff to release into the duodenum. And the stuff that comes out comes from these things called acinar cells, all right? And acinar cells live in these little branches. You can remember earlier when we were looking at the mouth and we saw these like little glands that were like releasing stuff? Kind of get that sort of in your head, right? Acinar cells are producing enzymes that are going to be critical in actually breaking down food. And you can see that each one of our three colors that we talked about are represented here. We have our trypsinogen and our chymotrypsinogen in green, which are going to be involved in, you guessed it, breaking down proteins. But again, these are ogens at the end. These are zymogens. So these aren't going to be actually breaking down the food directly, they're going to be secreted in their inactive form, but then they're going to be activated. We have pancreatic lipase, which is going to be involved in breaking down fats. We're going to have pancreatic amylase, which is also going to be breaking down sugars. And so all of these things are coming out of the acinar cells, and they're going to be traveling through the acinar cells, through these little bulbs, out into the duodenum. And so that's super critical that you know that the exocrine pancreas secretes these 3 enzymes into the duodenum to break down food. And so now, just a little bit of review. We've gone through here, we've secreted our juices and our enzymes from our pancreas. Our liver and gallbladder have secreted bile to help us go ahead and emulsify the fat. So now we're ready. We've broken down all of our stuff into the simplest thing that it could be. We're actually finally ready to begin absorbing things. And that's when we reach the jejunum and the ileum of the small intestine, which are, the latter 2 portions, the segments of the small intestine. And this is where we hit a buzzword that you'll see over and over and again while you're studying for the Mcat, and that is the brush border. And the brush border is really just imagine a bunch of little tingly fingers and stuff, and each one of these tingly fingers can absorb stuff, out of the lumen. Imagine sticking your fingers into a bowl or something like that, and then you're able to absorb sugar or whatever through the fingers, right? Think about that, but millions and bajillions of little fingers. And those fingers can be broken down into 2 main classes. So we have our villi, which are kind of overall these really big structures, and these serve to increase the surface area within the small intestine itself. But then on top of that, each one of these individual cells has little extensions of it called microvilli, and these cells are called enterocytes. They're absorptive cells. So overall, you have these huge structures, which are called the villi, and then you have these tiny little hairs on individual cells, and one of these cells may have tons and tons of these, maybe 20, 30, 40, just lots. Imagine lots of them, and those serve to increase the surface area of individual cells. So overall, within this space, you've managed to basically several fold increase within the surface area, and that allows for tons and tons of absorption to take place at these enterocytes, which are going to be doing the bulk of that. Now it's important to note that we also have goblet cells that are within the jejunum and the ileum, and those secrete mucus, because again, you don't want this area to dry up. You want it to be lubricated. You want food and the digested stuff to basically be traveling through here and getting getting through. You don't want anything to dry up within this area. So you're going to secrete that mucus to keep everything lubricated. Now, as you can see, this area is called the lumen. The lumen is where all of the fun juicy stuff is, right? But we want to get stuff from the lumen across into this red and blue. You might be able to recognize that as capillaries, but this is going to be our circulatory system. And then you have this yellow thing called the central lacteal. Now, why is it yellow, you may ask? It's because it's for fats, all right? Remember color coding. So central lacteal is a part of the lymphatic system. All right, I'll go ahead and write that down here. The lymphatic system is technically our immune system. That's the other context that you would have heard this in. But the lymphatic system is actually what ends up taking in the facts. The lymphatic system is what's actually going to be ending up taking in these fats and allowing it to enter our bloodstream ultimately. Now, the lymphatic system actually drains out in your heart, and then only then is it going to actually merge with your circulatory system. But remember, the fats don't actually go into your capillaries right off the get, going into your circulatory system. They're actually absorbed into the lymphatic system. We'll talk a little bit about that. So ultimately, fats released into the lymphatic system in what are called chylomicrons. We'll get to that. And proteins and carbs are absorbed directly into your bloodstream via these enterocytes, all right, at this brush border. So, digestion of fats. Fats, obviously, we have, these individual fatty acids. We can also have, triglycerides over here, which are basically just a glycerol backbone, and then you have 3 fatty acids held together via esters, right? But obviously these are huge, globules, relatively speaking, globules of fats, and so we need to go ahead and emulsify that. We did that with our bile salts, right, that were produced by the liver, so they're going to emulsify the fat. They have inner portions that are going to be very hydrophobic, right? And then we're going to have outer portions that are going to be hydrophilic. And so that allows these things, oh man, my spelling, please don't roast me, hydrophilic, that are going to allow us to have these things be basically emulsified and actually able to like float around in the bloodstream or in like the lumen where it's an aqueous environment, right? And so basically we're going to take our bile salts and that's going to emulsify our fat, and then we're going to get to the point of micelles. Now micelles, you can think of them as kind of, I'm not talking about like like warships and stuff like that. I'm talking about these things, all right? They're little balls, and you can kind of think of them as lollipops, right? But the thing is that they have these droplets, these little, phospholipids, right? That have overall narrower tails down here than they do heads, and that causes them to form this circular shape. But this circular shape in the middle, that's a super hydrophobic region. And because it's a hydrophobic region, we can actually emulsify fats, and we can actually hold on to fats in the middle. So these micelles will enter our enterocytes as basically containing triglycerides and fatty acids and whatnot. They'll travel through a smooth ER before going through the Golgi apparatus, and then they're packaged into what are called chylomicrons, which are then secreted out of the enterocyte and enter the central lacteal to be drained out into the lymphatic system. And so that's really key. They don't go through the capillary. Notice how this arrow goes over that. Instead, they go straight to the central lacteal. And so that's kind of the critical thing to note about fats. All right, and so with that, we're going to end up in pretty much close to the last destination, which is the large intestine. And now the large intestine can also be called the colon, but the ultimate purpose of the large intestine is to take out the remaining water that is within the feces, right? And so remember, the last part of our small intestine was, if we go back up here, the ileum. And the first part of our large intestine is called the cecum. And right at that junction, wouldn't you know it, they called it the ileocecal valve, because there's the ileum on this side and the cecum on this side. So that's a really good way to remember it. The cecum is basically where we house bacteria, and bacteria are super important because they're able to digest food that we may not be able to, right? Keep in mind, like, one of the things the Mcat really likes to ask is, like, why for example can we not digest, like, just like grass, right? And that's because grass is held together by beta linkages, right? And beta linkages, if you'll remember, are when you have basically, you have your sugar, right? Sorry, I'm totally butchering this now that I'm doing it on the spot. But you have your sugar, and that's because, your group, like your oxygen, is going the same direction as, this group over here. Right? And typically, because both of these sides are pointing up, right? Your oxygen from your bond is going up. Your anomeric carbon over here, as well as your OH from back over there, which is like the little area, the remaining little leg of your sugar. This is a beta form, and our body is not able to digest this like beta form of sugars. We can only digest the alpha form, which is when we have this like opposite arrangement where one side is going up and the other side is going down. But sometimes you can have bacteria that are able to digest structures that your body may not be able to have the enzymes to digest otherwise, and that's super important. So that's basically where they all live. They all kind of chill over here in the cecum. You also have your appendix here, but honestly, do not worry about the appendix for the exam. There's a little hole here that connects the appendix to the large intestine, but like the thing is that, like, if that gets blocked with stuff, that can lead to appendicitis, which is inflammation of the appendix, and that can cause issues. But in reality, nobody really knows what the appendix does, so don't worry about it for this exam. A little bit of anatomy to know for the large intestine is that you have the ascending segment, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is, food, or not food. I guess at this point you're almost at feces. Feces is basically rising up through this segment and ascending in the ascending segment. It travels transverse side to side in the next segment, and then there's the descending segment, which is where it's going down, and then there's the sigmoid segment. And the way that you can remember the sigmoid segment is it's kind of like an S. I tried to draw that here, I apologize, but just think of sigmoid S at the end of it when you're drawing this thing, and that basically empties out into the rectum. Which stores our feces until, we need to go ahead and poop. And then at that point, it travels through the anal sphincter and then out the other side. And over here, I've done a really just, It's a very simple picture of the bacteria that live in your cecum. They help you digest stuff that you otherwise wouldn't be able to digest. And in that process, there could be the release of gas. And then they also help us to produce vitamin K, which is like super important in like clotting. And so that's super key. So overall, that's kind of what you need to know about the large intestine. But I really hope that this review of kind of like, what's really going on in the body, how are we going from point A to point B, and getting food from your mouth, out the other end. And that's through the help of all of these organs working together in this super, super beautiful system. So if you have any questions, feel free to always, drop it in the comment section. We're really trying out new things on this channel. But yeah, I hope you all really enjoyed that video.